Okay. Ooh, it's loud. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So, because we want to maximize our time with Cole, and I know that folks will drift in. The 9 o'clock service has just finished, and so folks will be drifting in. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So, Cole, if you're there and want to get on screen, we'll go ahead and get started. So, welcome. There's Cole. Uh, Cole, we're just grateful that you're with us. We've been excited all Lent for this moment to be with you, because we've been reading your book during the season of Lent. We have this practice as a parish called One Church, One Book, where we read a book together in a particular season of the liturgical year. And so we picked this here flesh for our Lenten study. And so I can say that anticipation of this conversation with you has made the reading of the book all the more meaningful for us. So welcome. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Thanks for reading the book and having me in your space.
Great. So you wrote this book in the fall and winter of 2020 during the coronavirus pandemic. And you mentioned in the book that you were in isolation due to being immunocompromised. And then in your acknowledgements, you mentioned your church and your rector, quoting, "who know more than most what a difficult season I've written this book in, and who never missed an opportunity to drop off food or flowers or toys or books in support of us." And so we're just curious, are you an Episcopalian? And if so, can you share a little about your journey to and with the Episcopal Church?
Sure. I would say that is the Christian tradition I'm closest to. I would say that's the Christian tradition I'm closest to. I no longer attend the church that is in that acknowledgement. It's not for lack of love, just for trying to find a place that makes the most sense and feels really true to who I am and how I think about God. But I first began attending an Episcopal church was when I was in my 20s, probably 24, and I began working for one. And that was my entrance. I was working for an Episcopal church on the main line of Philadelphia in partnership with a small Catholic university. So my job was kind of suspended between those two areas. And I'd encountered liturgy before, but it was the first time, liturgy touched a part of me, it touched a part of my soul that was really hungry for not just the beauty of the writing. I'm a writer. I studied writing in undergrad, and so I would encounter this liturgy and think, man, this is just beautifully written. But also there was something about the liturgical atmosphere that felt very restful for me, to not have to constantly contrive a form for encountering the divine, to not have to constantly contrive the right words to say or the right posture to take, to have this kind of form offered up for me in a liturgical setting, I think was really restful at a time where I was exhausted. Yeah.
I love that. I love this. I've never really thought of the liturgy as restful. Yeah, but that makes sense. That makes sense. Well, the title of your book, This Your Flesh, of course, comes from a very powerful passage in Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved. And I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind reading that passage for us, if you've got a copy of your book handy.
I don't, but I could I can pull it up.
Okay. Or if not reading the passage, could you just comment on it then? I mean, I'm just curious and would just like to hear from you how you talk about the passage and how you are encountering God in the clearing, and how bodies are so important. But can you tell us how you came to connect that passage of baby Suggs speaking to her people in the clearing with what you were trying to do in your book?
Sure. I mean, when I was thinking about, what kind of spirituality I wanted to engage in the book, I knew I wanted to honor that I'd been formed most recently in a Christian tradition. I wanted to honor that. I also started to think of, other spiritualities or other paths to God that, made sense for who I am. And even before I was writing, I've always kind of come back to the clearing. I read Beloved for the first time in undergrad, and I've always kind of come back to the clearing as the clearest site of healthy spirituality. Maybe healthy isn't the right word, but like good spirituality. That the clearest site of that has been the clearing. So I have a little passage up, and I'll read it to you and share a little bit why. But Toni Morrison writes this. When warm weather came, baby Suggs, holy, followed by every Black man, woman, and child who could make it through, took her great heart to the clearing, a wide open place cut deep in the woods, nobody knew for what, at the end of a path known only to the deer and whoever cleared the land in the first place. In the heat of every Saturday afternoon, she sat in the clearing while the people waited among the trees. Morrison writes that baby Suggs situates herself on this huge flat rock and bows her head, and that the people know that she's ready when she puts her stick down. So I'll paraphrase from here on out, but she puts her stick down and she says, "Let the children come." And the children all run from the trees toward her. She says, "Let your mothers hear you laugh." And the woods ring out with laughter. She says, "Let the grown men come," and the men step forward. And she says, let your wives and your children see you dance." So the ground starts to come awake under their feet as they start to dance. And finally, she calls the woman to her. The woman come to the center of the clearing, and she says, "Cry. For the living and the dead, just cry." And the woman let loose without covering their eyes, she writes. And so she says it started that way, and then they all kind of got tangled up in each other until the woman stopped crying and started to dance, and the men sat down and cried, and children danced, women laughed, and they collapse in this clearing, panting for breath. And it's into that breath that baby Suggs gives her sermon that the book is titled from. In this here place, we flesh that weeps, laughs, flesh that dances on bare feet in grass, love it hard. And she launches into this beautiful monologue about loving the physical, with an acknowledgement of what's lurking beyond the clearing, all of the things that seek to, demean their dignity. She talks about, she gives the gospel of caring for the embodied, enfleshed soul. Intergenerationally, right? You have the different generations emotionally, an emotional liberation, and also an embodied liberation as they just engage in this very physical act together. So all that to say, when I think about the spirituality I wanted to encounter in this here flesh, that very much so is my model: intergenerational, emotional, connected to the interior life, and deeply embodied.
It's beautiful. That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. And as you were I was like, I felt myself in the clearing when you were describing it. And it also made me think about just the chapters in the book. It just feels like the whole book, was there in terms of like lament, but also joy and embodiment and dignity and liberation. Every chapter of the book was was in that clearing. Yeah. So your first chapter, of course, is a chapter on dignity, which I think really grounds the book. And you connect inherent dignity with human beings created in the image of God. And one of the things I ask folks to do, we had several small groups reading your book, and then a larger group in this space on Sunday mornings reading the book. And I just asked folks to send me questions that they might have about the book and in preparation for this time with you. And if we have time at the end of this conversation, I'll open the mic for some other questions. But so one person sent this question from the chapter on dignity. They say, you mentioned the need for the diversity of people their stories and cultures to reflect God more fully. Can you talk more about that?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it's a beautiful theology. I mean, it certainly doesn't originate with me, but there are theologies that talk about, humans being made in the image of God. It's a pretty central. I mean, in the Episcopal Church, we talk about that, of course. And there's a kind of particularity to the Christian thought that says it's not just that I alone image the divine. I alone, am an adequate mirror for the image of God, but it's in the collective. It's in the micro community of Adam and Eve. They together mirror the image of God. And if you expand that a little bit, it's to say, I need you, I need your face, you need my face. And I'm saying that metaphorically and literally in a way, I guess, but I need you in order to image an expansive, a truly expansive and limitless divine. I need every kind of face to be welcomed in the garden, so to speak. I quite like that theology. I think it's beautiful that you can image the divine in part as an individual, but truly the goal is this like collective imaging. I think that speaks beautifully to the work of the church, and just beautifully against the formation of kind of rugged individualism that Western society has impressed upon us. So I mean that in terms of race, the different races, but I also mean in terms of loves, in terms of personalities, in terms of stories. To have that diversity in the collective, I think will give us the truest imaging of God.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, and I think you also point out in that chapter when we lose sight of that expansiveness or that multiplicity, or that God is a multitude, and we try to make God in our own image, or limit the image of God to a certain type of person or a certain race of people, that we really do great harm and great damage. So that idea of the multiplicity, the diversity that's within God really keeps us in that clearing, in that expansive place. So, throughout the book, you do offer some insightful and challenging critiques of Western Christianity. And as I read them, you're making those critiques, not as an outsider, but as someone who's still engaged in the tradition. And I hear that you're still discerning, in the tradition. But this question comes from one of our youth, and I don't know if you can see them over there, but they're at the table doing their little fidgety, doodly things. So they read the book too. So this is a pretty intense question, but it comes from one of our youth. Can you describe your decision to remain a Christian despite the broader American church's position as a seat of white supremacist patriarchal power? And how did you use your faith and/or your understanding of Scripture to combat this concept of Christianity?
Wow.
Yeah.
Who's raising these kids? Yeah, that's a very, very good question. Yeah, so for me, I think there are people in this world who are very, prone to belief. Like if you've ever just met someone at church that just has a really solid sense of, who God is, a really, solid sense of what's true and what's not true. I've never been that person since I was a little girl. I've never been someone who's had a strong sense of belief. Some of that is linked to just general distrust in humanity from a young age, but also I've just never been someone who I never believed in Santa Claus, like all of the stories. I've really struggled, because I think that often in Christian spaces, there's a demand that is made on our capacity for belief, a demand, and almost like to enter, you must believe, all who enter must believe. And it can be really damaging for those of us who, aren't sure and are probably whose spiritualities contain more doubt than certainty. So I've had to really work hard because if I, absorbed what Christian spaces tell me about Christianity, it would be so dependent on how much belief I can muster on any given day. And I reached a point in my 20s where I just started to resist that definition of faith, a faith that is only comprised of belief. I started to think, okay, are there other components to faith besides just how much I'm able to believe that Jesus rose from the dead on a given day? Are there other components? And I think, yes, I think ritual, is a component of faith. I think, myth, I think storytelling, I think community, all of these things are different components of faith. So I'll start by saying my relationship to Christianity doesn't solely hinge on belief anymore. I have a more expansive view on what comprises faith. And along with that, I've had to be really kind of open-handed with the fluidity of what my relationship with God looks like. That's not to say I, completely resist all doctrines and all creeds, but it is to say that, if I wake one morning and no longer identify with a particular creed, it doesn't mean I'm going to depart from, Christianity altogether. I don't know. I think you have to have, and maybe I hear a little bit of a kindred spirit in the question, which is why I'm asking it, answering it the way I am, because, I hear some of myself in that, to have a kind of, I don't know, stability of heart, stability of self, to say, my God doesn't need to look exactly like the person in the pew next to me in order for it to be real, or at least real today. There's a book written by Octavia Butler called Parable of the Sower, very controversial. There's a little 14-year-old girl who kind of makes up her own religion. Her dad's a Christian priest. She makes up her own religion. Very controversial. But the beauty of it, she's striving. She's striving for a form for the divine that does resonate with her, instead of the typical departure, like altogether departure, because her God didn't look like the God of her father. And in the book, the kind of refrain is, my God has another name. And so can that be okay in a sense? Okay to really explore that, and for it not to have to be identical, for it to someone else's belief about the divine in order for it to matter. That all is in resistance to white supremacy, white patriarchy, by the way, which loves, to put conditions upon our belief, which loves kind of neat boxes and categories. That's supremacy all over it, because when you have neat boxes, you can easily organize those boxes and create a hierarchy of them. So even just refusing to exist inside of, binaries, and letting yourself be okay with the fluidity of your divine, you are, operating in resistance to a lot of these systems, even if it doesn't immediately kind of seem like you are. It's a very long answer.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to the youth who asked the question. So that's great. Yeah. So let's see. I'm curious about your use of the word praxis. And for example, you talk about the praxis of anger, interior and exterior, in the chapter on rage. And so do you see praxis as a component to each of the chapters? And if so, could you say more about that?
Yeah. Yeah, I do. That's hard for me, but I do. I thought, oftentimes contemplatives, if there are any, fellow contemplatives in the room, we tend to be prone to kind of living in our heads a bit and defining contemplation by thought, in kind of rigorous thought. I'm trying my best in this here flesh to kind of do something slightly distinct, not completely distinct. There are people who have done it as well, but slightly distinct in, the stories in a way are, I don't know, maybe like fragments of praxis or a lived experience. It's not just kind of these abstract thoughts and yeah, this kind of theoretical, spiritual, philosophical text, which is what I wanted to write, by the way. Like, I didn't plan on incorporating story into it at first. I thought I was just going to write this kind of spiritual, contemplative text and kind of let that be that. Those pieces of contemplation you see in each chapter, that was going to be the whole book. And it didn't feel true to who I am as a writer, but I also feel like coupling it with like lived experience, coupling it with my father, parting our hair and greasing our scalps in the morning, like dignity comes awake in a different way. Any contemplation, any rigor of thought I have about dignity, it comes more alive when you're, when I'm in between my father's legs every morning and he's parting and saying, do you look good? You feel good? Something changes. So I tried to do that in each chapter through story to say that these are the questions of what it means to be human. And here are the humans living those questions. They're in my family, my father, my grandma, myself. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, you mentioned your father, and our folks really enjoyed, hearing the stories about your father and your grandmother. But one of our small group facilitators had this question. She says, I'm wondering about your father's response to your book, both how he felt about putting his story out there once it actually went to print and the rave reviews it has received. And then the facilitator says, for the record, I think your father is brilliant and brave. So.
I love that. And I will tell him that he is both. Yeah, I haven't really spoken about this, but my family hasn't read the book. There's one cousin in my family who's read This Year Flesh. She read it like the day it came out, cover to cover immediately. I knew she would. And for multiple reasons. One, I don't come from a family of readers. They would never claim, if there was a book in our home growing up, it was mine, and from the library. We didn't, it's just not the kind of environment we're from. But also my grandma, who's such a central part of the book, she passed maybe 2 or 3 months before the book was published. And so her story, it's still very raw to us as a family. It's to other people, it's like, oh, it's been a while, but she's just was such a matriarch, such a large figure in our family that I think losing her, the book, in a beautiful way, but also in a really painful way, has become an artifact of grief for many people in my family. And, to open and see her words, it's difficult. So I'm fine with them not having read it. My father is very proud, and he was we're a very private family, like extremely, I know it doesn't seem it based on the stories I've told, but extremely private. And so my father and I had never spoken even slightly about his addiction prior to, interviewing him and getting these stories down. Prior to writing the book, there are places in our stories in our family that everyone knows, but not many dare to kind of enter out of respect, out of reverence, out of fear, out of whatever. And I was really, really fortunate to have both my grandma and my father in a particular time in their life where there was this openness and this trust with me, just to trust that, I'm able to travel into the stories with them without being destroyed. I think a lot of our elders, the reasons why they kind of hold back the details of their lives is because they're trying to spare us. So I had to do a lot of work to kind of show them, I'm not gonna be destroyed by this. I can hold this with you. And I also had to do a lot of work to kind of refine my own curiosity. I think I had my ability to ask a question, like, goodness, it was just completely atrophied. You realize that when you're interviewing, people you love, because you get used to these very trite or these very general questions. And I had to get really specific, really detailed. And my father slowly and my grandma slowly allowed me to kind of go to those places and trusted, no, I don't want to just hear, your general story. I want to know what your father's face looked like when you ran away from him that day in the park. I want to know what route you took home, and it took a lot for him to trust that I cared and that I could, stay present to those details. But yeah, my father is amazing. I try not to idolize him still, but it's very difficult. He is brilliant, man, not without his vices, but certainly brilliant. Yeah.
And so folks were curious, at least one person wanted to know, how is he doing now?
My father is doing great.
Yes.
He's, clean, healthy, living in St. Pete, Florida, living his best, I don't know how old he is, 50-something-year-old life. And yeah, really grateful for that.
That's great. That's great. Let's see. So you begin some of your chapters with these beautiful, magical stories. And I have to say, the first time I sat down to read the book, I was sitting outside at a retreat center. It was the last fall. And when I got to that story about the birds, that begins the chapter on place, I just burst out into tears. It was so beautiful. But you've got that story about the birds, the story of the wind in the chapter on belonging, the story of the tables in the chapter on liberation. And so I'm assuming you wrote these, you channeled these stories, or could you say more about these stories and where they come from?
Yeah. I'm glad they resonated with you. I had all the expectations that my editors would give me a hard time about those random myths throughout, but they really understood. There wasn't much pushback at all. I had prepared this kind of long speech in favor of keeping these weird little myths throughout, but I didn't need it. So I'm grateful for that. And yeah, so when I talk about Christianity being one kind of thread in my overall spirituality, I know that there are people, and whatever is right for you is right for you, but there are people whose spirituality and whatever religion they find them in, it's kind of synonymous, or that's the whole container is religion. I'm not one of those like spiritual, not religious people, by the way. Spiritual and religious. What I mean to say is, if there's a tapestry of my spirituality, Christianity is one thread. What are the other components that make up the spiritual dimension of my life? And, I wasn't raised in a Christian family. My dad's not Christian. My grandma's Christian, was Christian adjacent, but was deeply harmed and abused by the Christian church. And so I started to think, what was the spiritual dimension that kind of made up my family if it wasn't going to church, and if it wasn't a doctrine or a creed or a belief about, exactly who God is. And myth emerged as kind of like one of my family's spiritualities. We're big myth people. Like we make up these stories and we tell them to our children, these unsuspecting children. We pass on these and some of them have been in the family for generations, and some of them you're just sitting at a table and you hear my Uncle Dave say something completely strange and mystical to like my little cousin about her having unicorn blood, and you just kind of pause. So I wanted to incorporate myth to kind of honor that, to honor this other form for my spirituality. And so I started, the myths were the easiest thing to write for me. I want to write a whole book of them, I think. But I started, just writing them down, connecting, the big stories of the natural world, and trying to connect them to something true. Yeah, and I think it works at times. I don't know if it works all the time, but they're in there now. Can't do much about that. But yeah, I think myth gets a really bad name. It carries a really bad connotation, and I'm trying to revive that. I want to resurrect it. There's actually beauty in myth across history, across the history of our humanity. We've made sense of who we are through myth and through mythic storytelling, and I wanted to reclaim that a little bit.
So this next question I'm going to read a little bit from your chapter on repair to kind of provide the context. But I was struck by the passage where you say, there's some of us who have grown weary of talk of a reconciliation. This is probably because it comes to us on the tongues of men who have paid no time to the process of true repair. It is both ego and shame concealed in shallow unity speak that regresses any progress that has been made. And then you go on to say, and of course, you'd be right to ask the question, can we be reconciled if there was no harmony to begin with? I suppose it is my faith that allows me, despite all the lack I see, to trace the plumb line back to an origin story of harmony, a shalom that can be repaired, however slowly and painfully. So here at St. David's, we've been engaged in anti-racism work. And one of the things that some of us have struggled with is this notion that there is some wholeness or balance that we lost and need to get back to, when in reality there was never such a place to begin with. And so can you speak to this in light of what you said about a shalom that can be repaired?
Sure.
Yeah.
I can try.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hearing this more and more, this sense. I mean, I hear it a lot on social media that, there was never any kind of, they don't use the word harmony, but harmony, so to speak, to begin with. So what are we really getting back to? And I think it's a really credible question. I think the feelings behind it are really credible. For me personally, I just have to believe that, whether you believe in, the garden and the kind of shalom of the Abrahamic God, or whether you believe something else, I think I just have to believe there was some original kind of shalom, some original unity, not just unity, but mutuality and solidarity, in order to survive, to have any hope. It's like, I need to believe that was original to us, original to the cosmos, was some kind of harmony. Not everyone does, that's fine, but it's what I need to believe. And I see it a lot in nature and this interdependence. And I think that gives me a little bit of sense of solidity in the belief this in nature, this, beautiful interdependence in our ecosystems. And if one creature falls, how it can collapse an entire ecosystem. You see this beautiful kind of, not just unity, but I say mutuality in the sense of like, I need you. Not just, it's nice to have you here. It's like, I actually need you for my survival. So I personally think that's where we're coming from, is this very distant sense of shalom, even if it was only ever observed in like the non-human realm. But I would like to think, in the original sense of creation, there's some kind of shalom that we're maybe not able to get back to, but able to pursue, pursue the memory of. But it's difficult. I don't think that's what most people are saying when we talk about unity. I don't think most people are talking about, this beautiful kind of natural interdependence where we need each other and, we don't survive without each other. I think most people are talking about a sentimentality or like a feeling of everything's right, everything's okay, right? We're okay. We can, sit together and laugh, and I won't feel uncomfortable in your presence. I think for most people, when they're talking about unity, it tends to be about, this sensation one feels when you no longer are confronted with your own guilt and you can relax at a table. Something altogether wrong with that, but when that's the purpose, it's completely fraudulent. The act of repair is fraudulent. It's more about alleviating some populations or some individuals' guilt, as opposed to actually offering true compensation, true repair, and it not looking, peaceable in the sense of my conscience is at peace. You might have to live with that, but if that's what you're pursuing in unity, is this kind of alleviation of conscience, I think people smell that smell that in Christian spaces, but like, let's all hold hands and sing a song, and people smell the illusion. And it makes, I think, those of us who have been historically excluded and neglected very hesitant to approach kind of racial reconciliation spaces. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Just a couple more questions, and then I'm going to open it up for folks who'd like to put the microphone up here, and you can come to the mic and ask a question if you'd like. So there are at least two beautiful passages in your book that speak about the Eucharist, and both of them have to do with the body. I love that passage where you say, we don't just bow to the bread, we eat it. I also love that passage where you talk about passing the peace to your own body. And so I'd like for you, if you don't mind, just to reflect some more on the meaning of the Eucharist in your life.
I apologize if you can hear this background sound. I'm in a hotel. I hope it doesn't keep happening. Yes, I can. You asked me when we first began, so are you Episcopalian? One of the things that I think is tying me, I said that's the Christian tradition I feel closest to. One of the things that ties me to it is kind of, the understanding of the Eucharist. I want to be in a church that receives the Eucharist weekly. People are surprised by this in me because so many of my beliefs seem unorthodox. And then here I come saying, I want to receive the Eucharist, the most orthodox, ritual we have maybe. But there's something about that embodied, the symbol of it being this embodied reconciliation. We could have had a ritual where we all approached the altar, together after passing the peace. We could have had a ritual where we all approached the altar and, a nice prayer is said over us. Like that would have been very us, very, Western church of us, very Thomas Cranmer of us. We could have just approached, said a very nice blessing, and then departed, But instead, you have this act that stretches back, of course, far past the, Episcopal tradition, but you have this act that requires a body, and you have this representation of the divine that isn't just, cognitive. It's not about words. There's something so mysterious in it being this physical representation, and that the physical representation, I said, we don't just bow to it, we eat it. We could have just had, the bread and the wine sit there and done a nice gesture, but the fact that we actually allow it to nourish ourselves, I think is so mysterious. It's so weird. Oh, it's so weird. So that's the queerest thing we have in the church, that's the queerest thing about us. We should broadcast that more because it's so strange, and yet it's so tender and beautiful. And I think nurturing in a world that, and in spiritual spaces that ask us to give so much of our bodies to sustain this church system. We're asked to give and give and give, often without pay. And it's this beautiful ritual of saying, actually, receive and allow yourself to be nourished. This is sacred too. It's not all sacrifice. Yeah, I could probably rant about the Eucharist for longer than you want me to. You asked about passing the peace as well around my body, which is kind of, what we do before we approach the Eucharist table together. But I think there are these, these rituals in our rites, in our, in our services that so beautifully translate to our daily lives. But I, for so long, kind of had them contained to the altar, contained to a pew. And that moment in Paris on the bed where I was passing the peace around my body, I feel like was a really tangible, it was like a really clear bridge, from altar to daily life that I'm trying to recreate often. There, these embodied rituals can be taken, not taken out of their home, but they can journey with us. Yeah.
Right. So one last question from me, and then I'll open it up. And we want to try to end at the kind of the top of the hour. So So your last chapter on liberation was so rich, so rich. The Sunday morning discussion, I've been creating PowerPoints and putting little bullet point quotes from each chapter. And I had several slides with the bullet points from the chapter on liberation. So there are just so many profound statements there. And so if there's one thing from the chapter or the book that you would want us to remember about liberation, what would it be?
I think maybe that, I think the realization for me that liberation isn't a destination in and of itself. Like it's not an end game. It's a journey. It's a way of being human, a way of being in the world. Was really very, very healing for me. I for a long time felt like I was trying to, I almost subtitled the book, something on the walk to liberation, as if it was like a journey to liberation, the different chapters. And I changed that because I didn't want to give liberation's still the final chapter, but I didn't want to give the impression that it's something that you have to travel to and then you come to and you're like, I've arrived. I think it ebbs and flows, it's fluid, and sometimes the door is open and sometimes we wake and find that the door's been locked again in the night, and you can't really pinpoint why you feel trapped again, or why you don't feel the same expansiveness or kind of generosity that you did. But it's a way of learning how to unlock the door, how to call for help, how to strategize, how to organize, how to weep, a way to do that together. That's been very, very important for me. Like the clearing itself, that's not the destination of liberation. It's whatever compelled baby Suggs to bring her, that's just a gathering place. That's just a collective kind of reminder of our liberation. But it could be the journey. It's the journey itself to the clearing is just as liberating, yeah.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. All right, folks, I'm going to put the mic up here. So you just kind of line up and ask your question. And it's a pretty hot mic, so you don't have to get that close to it to ask your question. So I'm going to put it up here.
Hi, Reverend Braun here, total fangirl. I was in seminary during COVID. It was amazing. And your words and your prayers on social media carried us through in a way that I can't quite explain to you. And we are looking at doing a liturgy on Juneteenth and inviting some folks to speak. And I am putting together some prayers of the people that are from your prayers. And I want to know if that's okay, and if you have any suggestions for me.
Off the record, that's okay. On the record, I'm supposed to tell you that I'm writing a book currently of all of those prayers, and it will collect a lot of things. It's mostly new prayers inspired by Black liturgies, but I'm currently working on that book, so I've had to contractually be a little bit more stiff on granting permissions, but between friends, do what you need to do. And I wish you well, because I personally don't really care that much about the work spreading where it needs to spread.
I am super happy and want to be very respectful of your very important words. So maybe we'll send them to you before we use them. And
yes, but thank you for what you're doing. Thanks for organizing that. Especially for Juneteenth.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for sharing your heart with so many of us.
So Cole, could you say a little more about Black liturgies? I mean, Kristen referenced it, but and of course I follow you on Instagram, Black liturgies. So if you need to follow her on Instagram, Black Liturgies. But if you could just say more about that, that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah, Black Liturgies, it's a project I started like 2.5 years ago, where I connect written prayer with Black literature, Black emotion, and the Black body. So I'll often share a kind of quote or a poem from a Black thinker, maybe sometimes from myself, and then I'll connect that to a written kind of liturgical, liturgy-like prayer, and a breath prayer or a breath exercise, whichever you prefer to call it, an inhale, exhale kind of meditation. So I share that across social media. It's picked up a lot of steam on Instagram. It's at Black Liturgies. Yeah, if it feels right to you, you can follow me there. If you despise social media, that's just as well. I'm with you. You can stay far away.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for your book. The book offers lots of prompts and issues and, if you will, provocations for thinking about our lives, our spirituality, our liturgy, and our religion. And I like the fact that near the end of the book, you say, if you walk away, if the reader walks away and say, aha, now I've got it, you've in some ways failed. And I think it's a rolling, lasting effect. I won't ask you to expand on any of those prompts or thoughts, but I would imagine as the author of the book, as the person who wrote these words, you didn't walk away from writing the book the same person with the same faith and spirituality that you had before you began writing. So if you're comfortable with that, I'd ask you to sort of speak to how offering this book out into the world affected you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a beautiful question that I don't think I've been asked, because I did change so much in writing. I had this kind of mantra as I was writing, well, two really, of like, I just want to write the truest thing for who I am in this season. And a lot of my writing about, religion or about God up until that point had almost been aspirational, like things I wanted to believe, ways I wanted to think, often in order to belong to whatever spiritual space I was finding myself in. And, something about my spirituality intersecting with my writing, which I don't, before Black Liturgies, I wasn't a spiritual writer. I wasn't like a Christian writer or anything like that. I was writing entirely separate, but having that intersection, I had a real loyalty to myself as a writer. And when I'm writing anything, I always think about like my 60-year-old. I'm like haunted by my future self. And I often think about Cole at like 60, Cole at 70, if I live to be 70. And I imagine myself reading things that I've written, and I just want to feel proud, not to say that I'll think all of the same things when I'm 60 or 70. Surely I won't, but I'll be proud if I can look back and say, but you wrote the truest thing to you in that season. So having a kind of fidelity to my future self completely changed how honest I was on the page and honest I was in terms of my spirituality. And I learned that a lot of the things that I'd been trained to say that I believe, I really don't. And that makes me no further from God. It just means I'm able to be more honest, and I'm able to stop like hitting myself, because I can't manufacture the same kind of certainty that other people can. So there are a lot of maybes. I mean, I would say the maybes that made it through the editing process is probably like a quarter of the maybes I had in the book. My editors were like, "Cool, you can't say maybe about everything." And I'd say, "Well, I just don't know." I just don't feel sure about this. And that kind of freedom to kind of, live in the maybes, live in the uncertainty, live in a lack of clarity, a lot of ifs, if this is true, then that happens because I'm not sure it's true, and that's okay. So yes, I ended the book feeling very near to myself, very, very close to myself, and close to my own sense or lack of sense of the divine. And I also ended the book very close to myself in terms of like my family and the stories that I had access. I can't, you can't depart those so easily. They stay with you. And there's a beautiful quote by Alice Walker. She says, "How simple a thing it seems that to know ourselves as we are, we must know our mother's names." You know, how simple a thing it seems that to know ourselves as we are, we must know our mother's names. And she's getting at this kind of intergenerational knowledge of the self and engaging my grandmother's stories. My own face appeared to me, with greater clarity than it ever had before. And that changes you. Yeah, it changes how you engage the world. It changed me as a writer. Thanks for that question.
Hi, Cole. My name's Kelsey. I'm the youth minister, and me and the teens have been sitting over there pondering over how beautiful like your turns of phrase are. Like I found myself like scribbling down phrases and stuff, and so it got me really curious. I have two questions for you. My first is, what are you reading right now? And my second question is, for the rest of us, what would you recommend for continued reading? Now that we have completed reading your book, what should we start on next?
Oh, I'm currently reading a book called Bluets by it's Maggie something. My goodness, I can't believe I can't remember her last name. It's Bluets. It's a tiny little book. It's a short, and she's like, I think the subtitle is like a memoir in color or something like that. She's basically has these little fragments and reflections on the color blue. Yeah, it's one of those things that you either love it or hate it, but it's right up my alley. Some people think it's pretentious. I just think it's interesting. It's kind of genre bending. I read mostly fiction. I don't read much Christian fiction at all. Christian nonfiction, I mean, at all. I barely read nonfiction, let alone Christian nonfiction. So I can't really help you in terms of like book recommendations around faith or around spirituality, but I can tell you that there are a lot of fiction books that have formed my spirituality, probably more so than any nonfiction book. Well, depending on your age, I guess this should come with a rating. If you're, high school and older, there's a book called On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by a Vietnamese poet named Ocean Vuong. That's beautiful. So if you're really, talk about beautiful turns of phrases, his kind of apprehension of like language is like nothing I've ever really encountered. Even if you just watch a few interviews with him, really, Ocean Vuong, he's brilliant and tender. I also, again, this should come with like an age warning as well. High school and over, maybe college and over. Toni Morrison's Beloved is incredibly painful, incredibly traumatic, but it's my favorite book of all time. Yeah, there's a book I could give a lot, but I feel like I'll stop there. Yeah. No, I have to say, hold on one second. I have to say 2 more books, okay? There's a book called The Source of Self-Regard by Toni Morrison. That's nonfiction by her. We're really lucky. We're really privileged to have access to that. Beautiful thoughts and contemplations on memory. And then a book called The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. He, he's from the church, a black church, and he wrestles with God, wrestles with race in America. It's a very short book as well. I think anyone could read The Fire Next Time. Yeah, so I'll go those 2 as well.
Maybe I'll follow up in an email and ask you to send us a bibliography.
I would.
Well, it's because of a quote in Black Liturgies that I picked up Octavia Butler's book, The Parable of the Sower. Yeah, it's just incredible. Yeah. So we're at the close of our time with you. And of course, today is Palm Sunday, and we are entering into Holy Week. And so I'm wondering if there are any words or images that you could share with us that we could carry with us into Maundy, Thursday, and Good Friday, and Easter morning.
Yeah. Oh, I just wrote a little like a letter to I have a community there's a community of people on Patreon, and I've been sharing Lenten reflections on there. And I wrote about Palm Sunday. Mostly it's a reflection I wrote last year, and just how I don't feel like I can completely access the kind of the joy and the celebration, the waving of the palm branches, which, in my church, we kind of like march around the congregation, and it's this very joyous thing. And in this season, I don't really feel like I can access the joy of Palm Sunday. And the reality of what's coming this Holy Week is more awake in me than in other years. The reality of Good Friday and the death and decay of the world is feeling like it's overshadowing a God who did the unthinkable and rode on a donkey and came in rejecting this typical, I don't know, kingship, hierarchy, false superiority. It's beautiful, but I feel so distant from me. And so I've started to think about Palm Sunday. Okay, if I can't access the joy of it this year, can I access a kind of solemnity and also like a solidarity in it? The laying of, if you want to talk about the image, the laying of the cloaks on the ground, the laying of the cloaks on the donkey, which is kind of this act of tenderness toward the creature and toward the Christ, this tender act of padding. It's simple and small and maybe minor, but also there's some beauty and tenderness in that. So for me, I'm trying, and of course the solidarity of a God who is very disinterested in our views of king, our views of royalty, our views of superiorities. He's so disinterested in that. Is there a kind of solidarity that the divine mirrors to us that I can mirror? And it's made Palm Sunday a little bit easier to get through for me, to be honest, to kind of make that shift. We need people who are able to hold the joy. But if you're like me in this season and today, who it just feels so distant, is there kind of another way to, I don't know, engage other symbols, other meanings? For me, it's maybe tenderness and solidarity. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Holt. This has been Cole, this has been a very rich time and just a very tender time. So just thank you so much for being with us and for sharing your wisdom.
Thank you for having me.
Right. Well, safe travels wherever you are. So
Thank you. I'm in Maine, and I'll
Okay.
be home soon, thankfully. But thank you again, and thank you all for reading the book. Have a good day, and looking toward Easter with you.
Thanks, Cole.